and welcome to our second plenary, What is Public Engagement in Science? I'm Nanci Bompey, the Director of Media Relations at AGU, and I will be your moderator today. In today's plenary, we are going to discuss what it means when we call for public engagement with basic science. And to kick things off, we are first going to hear from Dr. Bruce Lewenstein. Dr. Lewenstein is a professor of science communication and former chair of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University, where he is also a full member of the Department of Communication. He works across the field of public communication of science and technology, including informal science education, citizen science, and communication training for scientists. He is active in international activities that contribute to education and research on public communication of science and technology, especially in the developing world. And as a historian, he tries to document the ways that public communication is fundamental to the process of producing reliable knowledge about the natural world. So now let's hear from Dr. Lewenstein about defining public engagement in science.
At least for those of you watching this from the United States. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this opening keynote address. My goal is to do some scene setting and maybe to provide some guides along some of the paths in the scene that we come to. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from Ithaca, New York. Both my home and my employer, Cornell University, are located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Later on, I'll come back to why I've begun with a land acknowledgement and why it has meaning in a conversation about public engagement. But first, I want to go back more than 40 years. It's been a long time since I graduated from college. There's a lot of gray in this beard. But one phrase from those years still sticks in my mind. Define your terms. For this meeting on science and public engagement, we need to be sure that we know what those terms mean. Not because they're unusual words, but in fact, precisely because they're too usual. We think we know what they mean. What we don't realize is that different people are using them in different ways. Let's start with science. Science is at least 3 different things. Science is a body of knowledge, science is a process for producing that knowledge, and science is a set of institutions. Even talking about science as a body of knowledge gets more complicated because there are all kinds of knowledges and there are at very different stages of understanding and use. So let's focus just on basic science, the concern of this conference. The idea of basic science has dominated American discussions of science and science policy since Vannevar Bush's Endless Frontier report at the end of World War II. But basic science is actually a relatively small part of science. Here in the United States, the NSF estimates that total R&D, research and development spending, was about $600 billion in 2018, the last year for which we have full numbers. Of that, about 70% was funded by business and about 20% by the federal government. The rest came from non-federal agencies or higher education or philanthropy. About 17% of that in 2018 was for basic research. 17%, only about 1/6 of the total science funding is for basic science. We need to remember that in order to keep our focus in this meeting, that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about science isn't what we're talking about. Moving on to science as a process. I don't mean the idealized hypothetico-deductive method, or indeed anything in particular that's called the scientific method. By the way, I haven't provided a credit on this slide for the X'd out diagram because I don't want to be critiquing anyone in particular. These kinds of images are pretty widespread. But I'm trained as a historian of science, and one of the clearest conclusions of historians, sociologists, and anthropologists of science is that there is no single scientific method. Experimentalists think differently than theorists, Biologists look for different kind of evidence and argue differently than geologists, and so on. What I mean by the scientific process is the messy process of having a bunch of data, mucking about in it, getting ideas that are drawn from logic or from dreams or from arguments with colleagues or from media stories about completely different areas of science, or even from a little too much ingestion of some mind-altering substance. By the way, I have references for each of those. And then after you've got those ideas, then you have to fight with your equipment and you make mistakes in your calculations and you try a bunch of different ways of making sense of the data and building arguments, drawing on a variety of lines of evidence and different rhetorical tools and so on. Yes, the idealized skills shown in the top right are there, but so is a lot more. It's an amazing process, or really I should say set of processes that produces reliable knowledge. Let me repeat, those messy processes produce reliable knowledge, but they're not a single thing. They're not something called the scientific method. So when we talk about the process of science, we have to be thinking of many things at once. Finally, science is an institution. When people think about science, they think about universities and sometimes government agencies, as numerous ad campaigns from big pharma and the chemical industry suggest, and as the R&D numbers that I cited a minute ago also suggest, whole categories of companies are part of science. People think of big buildings and campuses like these. The pictured here are the veterinary school here at Cornell, or the campus at NIH, or the American Cancer Society, or that other ACS, the American Chemical Society, or the Merck Research Center. And since we're here at a meeting hosted by the US Department of Energy, I need to include them as well. Particularly when we talk about trust in science, we have to recognize how tied up that is with trust in various social institutions and how that trust might vary across institutions in different times, in different places, among different social groups. Why have I dwelt on these definitions of science? Because when we get to the next topic, public engagement, we have to think about public engagement with what? It turns out, of course, that public engagement also means many things. There are areas of politics and civics and marketing and evaluating websites where there are whole literatures on engagement. Today, I'm going to focus in particular on the idea of public engagement with science. Even that idea, it turns out, has multiple origins and multiple ways of categorizing it. With those origins and categories come different assumptions about what the goals of engagement are, how they can be achieved, and how they can be assessed. I'm going to try to highlight some of those key goals in my discussion. Two of these meanings are the most common: engagement as an aspect of learning, what I'm calling educational engagement, and engagement as part of a participatory democracy process. While there are links between those two ideas, most practitioners and even many scholars are unaware of those links. There's a third kind of engagement that's become more common in recent years. It occurs through citizen science or public participation in scientific research. And finally, there's a fourth meaning of interest to many practitioners, although often missed by scholars, which is institutional engagement. Let's start with educational engagement. When the term public engagement with science started being used widely about 20 years ago, people in the informal science education community instinctively drew on the notion of engaging students in learning. The idea of engagement had been used for a long time in the education world. It's only about 15 years ago that researchers began to collate the different meanings of educational engagement. From that collation emerged a complex definition addressing at least 4 dimensions. First, there's academic engagement. That's the actual academic markers: time on task, credit earned toward graduation, homework completion, things like that. Then there's behavioral engagement. That's a broader measure than time on task, but it's also harder to keep track of. It's things like, is the student showing up for class regularly? Are they participating in class discussions? Are they doing the work? Or for our purposes in the science communication world, Are they at the museum? Are they playing with the exhibits? The third category is emotional or affective or psychological engagement. This is the motivational piece. Is the student actually interested in the material? Is the student want to be there? Or have you got a sullen teenager on your hands forced to come along, fiddling with exhibits, but actually thinking about the concert this weekend? And finally, there's cognitive engagement. That's the intellectual cognitive dimension. Is the student paying attention to the material? Are they learning the science? All of those are part of educational engagement. Especially when we're thinking about informal science education, moving beyond the formal world, we might want to add what we can call social engagement, because so much of what happens at museums or science fairs or nature centers involves families or other groups. This is true, for example, when I took my youngest son to Kirsten Ellenbogen's institution, the Great Lakes Science Center. This was a long time ago. He's about 27 years old now. That's the kid holding up the, where we're being sparked by the Grand Van de Graaff generator. Or when I took my oldest son to the Tech Museum in San Jose. But this kind of social engagement is also tied to lifelong learning and lifelong engagement. So that kid at the Tech now has his own son, who's already been introduced to several science museums. This kind of educational engagement and lifelong learning is what the Association of Science Technology Centers highlights on its website when it talks about public engagement. Now, this idea of educational engagement certainly encompasses science as a body of knowledge and science as a set of institutions, since some of it is based on actually attending the school or the institution. While there's always this hope that formal education will also teach science process in the complex way that I've described it, we know that's proven pretty hard to do. We could talk about it differently in the informal world. Next, we have participatory democracy. This is where the term public engagement with science emerged from scholars, activists, scholar activists concerned about issues of public participation in the governance of science. And by governance, I mean things like how much funding should science get, who should decide which studies are worth doing, what should the balance be among different disciplines, what role should science play in various policy discussions, and so on. Much of this discussion came from a research program in the United Kingdom. That program was stimulated by the 1985 publication of a Royal Society report on public understanding of science. It's often known as the Bodmer Report. The program included both broad social survey work on public knowledge of and attitudes towards science, modeled on a series of studies here in the United States, and also a series of case studies about interactions between particular publics and various kinds of scientific and technological knowledge. The public engagement tradition drew from two aspects of contemporary social science: the administrative approach, which emphasizes measurement, and the critical approach, which emphasizes issues of social power. The case studies spurred by the Bodmer Report in particular drew on a long tradition of research and commentary coming from the critical studies community on issues of participatory democracy and community development. Some of the labels used for that work include community-based participatory research, deliberative democracy, participatory action research, and public engagement. As the term public engagement was taken up by the science communication and informal science education communities, it came to mean primarily a series of activities focused on fostering interaction between scientists and publics. And these included citizen juries, consensus conferences, science cafes, science festivals, science shops, community science. And although many of these activities were inspired by the participatory democracy movement, many people, I think, in the science communication and informal science education communities were unaware of the political dimensions of those activities. For example, I've listed community science in the category of participatory democracy because it often involves a challenge to existing power structures, a point that was emphasized in a recent column in Science magazine. In their purest form, participatory mechanisms are intended to transfer power from elites to publics. This is particularly problematic for the scientific community, which has traditionally argued that decisions about science should be entrusted to the experts, the scientific community. So there's a way in which public engagement in the participatory democracy mode is in fact deeply threatening to the scientific community. Now, not every kind of participatory democracy engagement leads to complete power transfer. A long tradition of public meetings, for example, mandated by law for environmental issues, doesn't necessarily lead to decisions that scientists can't support. The inclusion of patients on FDA committees, Food and Drug Administration committees, for example, or more important for our discussion of basic science on National Institutes of Health committees. These are key examples of forms of participatory democracy. The participatory democracy type of engagement seems to be most concerned with science as a process and science as an institution. Indeed, one of the critiques of many of the participatory mechanisms is that it's hard to deal with science content through many of them. Next, we come to public participation in scientific research. Many people would call this citizen science, but I'm choosing a more restrictive term. Why? Because citizen science as a term can refer to at least three things. There's participatory democracy involving science, people making decisions about science. There's the participation of scientists in civic issues. These people are often called citizen scientists. And then there's public participation in research. To address this confusion, once again, define your terms. In 2009, some of the leaders of the current growth of citizen science introduced the term public participation in scientific research, or PPSR. Although many people engaged in citizen science are motivated by concerns about democratic access to scientific knowledge, that constitutes only one strand of the broader citizen science community. Many people, including participants, are more interested in ways that citizen science can contribute to educational engagement. And of course, many citizen science projects are driven by the science community, and the primary goal is to get some science done. From either perspective, I think we need to think of public participation as different than either educational engagement or participatory democracy. Many citizen science projects of the PPSR persuasion focus on both science content and, at least in their specific domain, science process. Not always. And some of them are explicitly designed to attract visitors to particular institutions. Finally, I want to mention institutional engagement. Many types of public engagement are driven by particular institutions, for example, schools or universities or museums. While each of these institutions wishes to contribute to the broader social good, they also seek their own institutional vitality. Some of them focus on education, some on citizen engagement, others on participation in research. But if you ask institutional staff about the meaning of public engagement, many responses focus on engagement with the institution itself, or at least that's what happened when I asked that question. Yes, they said, we want people to learn. Yes, we want people to be better able to participate in democracy. But what we really want is for people to come back to us. You see that most directly in the donate or become a member buttons, ubiquitous on institutional websites. Although the idea of institutional public engagement in science in particular has not been well studied, a number of brief articles, newsletter items, and reports highlight the importance of institutions engaging with local communities, both to contribute to community well-being and to sustain the institution itself. One proposal for data to gather by museums, for example, explicitly attempts to create an engagement measure of how many people from the community compared to how many people there are in the community have come and so forth. In some ways, this is like the marketing or website engagement I referred to at the beginning. But I think we have to acknowledge it and try to understand more about how science institutions use the idea of engagement. While the other forms of engagement that I've described deal with science as a body of knowledge and science as a process, The institutional engagement is mostly concerned with science as an institution. So, where do we end our discussion of public engagement with science? We have 3 meanings of science and 4 meanings of public engagement. I could try to create some kind of matrix, but I don't really think that's helpful. What I really want is for all of you to be able to be more reflective about what you're doing as practitioners or as researchers. What kind of engagement are you doing or studying? What are your goals? What audiences are you connecting with and why? Which methods will work best for the kind of engagement that you want to create or the kind of assessment or research that you want to do? There's no right answer, but I think that being reflective about these categories can help you think about your projects. And that brings me back to the land acknowledgement. It's not just a formula at the beginning of a talk. It's a moment of reflection, a chance to think about the specific opportunities and obligations that come from my presence on the land of the Gayakono. It means that I need to learn about the Gayakono nation, both its history and its present. That's educational engagement. And then I need to commit to supporting those who are seeking ways of acknowledging and moving forward in a world where we are more aware of diversity, equity, and justice, in a world where power is not distributed equally. That's like participatory democracy. I know there are citizen science or PPSR projects involving Native American communities and thinking about indigenous knowledge systems and where they fit in science. And finally, the very fact that my and many other institutions of science now have formal land acknowledgements suggests that there's a form of institutional engagement as well. For me, reflecting on the land acknowledgement is helpful in thinking about engagement. Reflection is part of what it means to be a professional in any field. I think we need more reflection in our field of public engagement. I hope as you go forward, you'll be able to use some of the ideas that I've described today to reflect on public engagement yourself. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you, Bruce, for setting the scene for our plenary discussion now about public engagement in basic science. And before we start, I'd just like to first quickly introduce the rest of our panel. Dr. Jayatri Das is the Director of Science Content and Chief Bioscientist at the Franklin Institute and an invited fellow of the Center for Neuroscience and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. She also serves as an advisor to the National Informal STEM Education Network. Dr. Das earned her PhD in evolutionary biology from Princeton University. And prior to joining the Franklin Institute, she conducted postdoctoral work at both the Koshland Science Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Kirsten Ellenbogen is the president and CEO of the Great Lakes Science Center, where she works at the intersection of rhetoric, science communication, and informal science learning environments. Dr. Ellenbogen was appointed to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee that produced learning science in informal environments and co-chairs the Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication Research and Practice. She is currently secretary of the board and co-chair of the conference committee of the Association of Science and Technology Centers. Dr. Ellenbogen received her PhD in science education from Vanderbilt University. And Dr. Ann Bartuska is a senior advisor at Resources for the Future. She was Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics at the USDA, as well as Chief Scientist. Prior to that, Dr. Bartuska was Deputy Chief for Research and Development at the USDA Forest Service. She also served as Acting USDA Deputy Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment and was the Executive Director of the Invasive Species Initiative at the Nature Conservancy. She is currently on the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Science and Toxicology and on the Standing Committee on Science Communication. Dr. Bartuska is an ecosystem ecologist with a PhD from West Virginia University. So now let's get right down to the discussion with our panelists. Just to remind everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. And so to get to it, as we heard, there are many definitions of both science and public engagement. And we can kind of use these definitions as a way to begin to reflect on the work that we do in engaging the public in science. And of course, the topic of this conference is specifically about engaging with the public around basic science. So to kick it off, why is it even important to engage with the public about basic science, and how do we do that? And thinking through these lens of these different definitions. So Kirsten, would you like to kind of kick things off for us?
Sure. I mean, Bruce gave us a great starting point for that in talking about the processes of science, the built-up fallacy around the notion of a method or a scientific method. And when you look at basic research as someone who spent many years working around science communication, interpretation for the public, there is so much to engage the public in around basic research when you want to connect their wonder about the world around them, when you want to help them understand different cultural viewpoints, different cultural ways of knowing. Those are very, very rich areas when you're working in basic science. So I would actually argue, as much as you see a lot of engagement around applied science in the news, people who are deeply working in public engagement of science absolutely value basic science as a way of really helping the public understand. And, you know, the pandemic has taught us very clearly that misinformation, disinformation, a lack of understanding about the nature of science and how science is done is fundamental to a lack of uptake and really acting in a way where we would have had a better hope for the public in really understanding why information has been changing through the pandemic, how that's been changing through the pandemic. If there was better understanding of nature of science, we might have seen a different public health response.
Jayatri, I guess to go on that same line, what do you think it kind of offers that basic science over kind of applied science? What opportunities or even challenges also do you think that basic science offers as opposed to maybe applied science?
Right. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the way Bruce laid this out for us is to bring in that emotional aspect of what engagement means. You know, when we look at how our these rifts in our culture right now, a lot of it feels like it comes from people who don't trust science because they don't feel like they belong in that scientific community. That science is done by institutions with with suspect motives or things like that. And in some of the forms of engagement that Bruce laid out for us, it's an opportunity for people to be scientists in ways that fall outside the narrow definitions of institutions. And so I think for us at museums, that's kind of what we hope for, is to help people feel like they belong in science, that they're part of this endeavor. And then, they're still, of course, recognizing and reflecting on that institutional motive that we all need to be thoughtful about. But hopefully, that emotional connection to science is something that might be easier to do with basic science, because it's more about the wonder and discovery than it is about some of the applications.
And Anne, I know we had talked previously about these categories of basic science and applied science. And do you think that actually, when talking about public participation in science, does that actually hurt things, you think, to place it in these categories or this construct that we've created?
Well, maybe riffing off a little bit more of what Jayatri was saying, we've really created science as somebody else's thing to do. It has its own institution mechanisms. You have to have degrees, you have to have elaborate infrastructure behind you to be able to do science. It's really simply asking the question why and trying to figure out why. And so to be able to explain to someone that just as somebody working in a microbiology lab understanding a problem that has no direct applications to you is the same thing as you asking the question, well, why do I have all those ants in my kitchen when I've got sugar on the counter? Those, and being able to make those connections, to me, helps bridge this divide we have between the individual and the science community. I do think it's hurt us a little bit to create this these two buckets called basic science and applied science, because it creates silos, it creates the organizational structures that support one versus the other. And I see that certainly in my world of natural resources, where we really are more about applied science because it's problem solving that has real application. But we also have to depend on foundational or basic science, because that's the deep inquiry where we may not know the answer. It's the high risk, high reward kinds of things. So again, I think we've created those different silos. Our struggle now is how do we create a continuum from the foundational and basic to the applied, to just solving that problem in my kitchen, where it really comes home very quickly.
And then this is a question kind of, I think, similar that came from the audience. Is there room when we're talking about basic science and the definition of basic science for traditional science knowledge that's been developed and tested in cultures outside of academic institutions?
I'd love to say a little on that one. And a great example, working with the Hmong community in St. Paul, Minnesota, and learning very quickly that the very Western tradition of our obsession with taxonomy and categorizing and naming, right, very quickly bumps up when you're working and looking at the world and at science through non-Western cultures. Quickly learned that this habit of over-categorizing things, right? So even the word science, for example, we had trouble translating that properly in Hmong language because rightfully so, right? There were very distinct words for what was meant by different kinds of science practices that we were lumping into one big category that really were very distinct practices, frankly, as Bruce pointed out, with different methodologies. And to Anne's point, even this habit of ours of, again, we've got to have these disparate categories of applied and basic science. I'm quite sure if I went back to the science leaders in the Hmong community that I was working with and talked about that, I'd get strong feedback about to what end, what does that serve in the advancing of knowledge in that area, to have that dichotomy.
Great. And another question, I think, kind of going off of that, also from the audience, is what could the role of science communication be to help the diatribe between the importance of knowledge versus belief, specifically as the basis for policy decision making?
Weigh in on that one, because I think one of the fundamental challenges we have is this notion of actually what communication of science is and how we get it out of institutions. I mean, the science centers are a wonderful place to really open it up and democratize the access to science. But we also want people to be translating their everyday problems into inquiry and being able to figure out what that means. So being able to give people the tools to find information that is credible, to really, I think one of the most important jobs we have out there are science translators who really get the way to take complex theory and make it real to people. Unfortunately, we don't reward those science translators nearly to the extent we should, and I think we're trying to overcome that. But I really find, actually, when I talk to students, that's one of the ongoing questions I get is, how do I get the training to be an effective communicator of my work outside of the lecture hall, outside of the professional societies? And I think giving people more the tools of that translation, the simplification of language around complex theory, to me, is a really critical need we should continue to work on as a community.
If I can just expand on that a little bit more too, is that that's really a long game, right? It's not like you can teach somebody the difference between knowledge and belief one day and have them make an educated policy decision the next, right? When we think about lifelong learning, it's about developing those habits of mind that thinking scientifically is just part of how you think, and that builds up to eventually applying that, whether to policy or whether to some of these everyday decisions that Anne's thinking about. And so I think that's the shift that we need to think about, is that when we're talking about engagement with basic science, we have to think about that long-term impact and not just what's going to happen in the next month or the next year.
And another interesting question that also came up was about this idea of two-way public engagement. And I know, Bruce, if you want to jump in here, but about the threat that truly this two-way public engagement with science poses to the scientific community, and how, as people who practice public engagement, how can we overcome that?
Yeah, so I think this has been a really interesting conversation I'm seeing going on in the chat about this. So the idea of basic science, the myth of basic science, is that it is purely curiosity driven, and therefore there should be no other kind of input to discussing what it is and where it goes. And while it is true that in the moment many researchers are driven by their curiosity, I think Jayatri called attention to the sort of the emotional, motivational piece to it. The reality is that we make choices about investing in physics or biology or geophysics at all different levels, at basic or applied or fundamental or whatever label you want to use. And so the concern that that many researchers have, that they don't want somebody else telling them what to do, when in fact they are always being shaped by what other kinds of forces are doing. This is the place where the two-way, or the notion of participatory governance, becomes very threatening to scientists. What do you mean you're going to tell me what I want to work on? Well, you're already being told what to work on, actually. I remember a time when we were doing some research about nanotechnology, and we went into a nano lab and we asked one of our undergraduate research assistants asked someone whether he was doing nanotechnology. And he said, well, the official US government definition is 10 nanometers to 100 nanometers. I'm working at the 250 nanometer scale. So, technically no, but I'm getting funded by the Nano Initiative, and I'm here in the Nano Lab. So I guess I'm doing nano, right? His point was that he was pursuing his curiosity, but he had to frame it as nano in order to get the funding, in order to get access to the lab. And these are the ways, this is just, it's a simple example of the ways in which various kinds of social forces end up shaping what researchers do at many different levels. And so I think that's part of what we need to be talking about, is helping people understand that complex interaction.
Kirsten, I saw you nodding. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Oh, well, I was laughing at one point because I think probably we're all guilty at times of trying to fit ourselves into a box to follow the funding, right? And there's something about the history of American science that shows that there's a long habit of that, and at some point there's got to be a balance between creating urgency and driving research towards an area where we as a society is determined there's need, and therefore the money is flowing in that direction, versus really having this public participation in science that perhaps would even drive some of the funding. And I don't know that we're there yet at all, but it's Bruce's talk is certainly raising a lot of ideas in my head about how we might get there.
And another question that comes up is about basic science and maybe being perhaps more neutral. And someone kind of asked a similar question about, in this seemingly intractable problem of people falling prey to, misinformation, maybe stems from the inability to see things with their own eyes. Do you think that educating people about the scientific method and about basic research could address that problem? Does basic research, basic science offer something that maybe applied science couldn't in trying to teach people about approaching the world or combating some of this misinformation. Jayatri, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think there's some really great communications research that shows that, when you, and specifically I'm thinking about climate communication, which is not basic science necessarily, but I'm going to use an illustrative example, is that, when you give people the opportunity to collect their own data and come to their own conclusion and make that go through the process for themselves, it involves them in a way that's different from somebody just telling them what the conclusion is. And I think that's a mindset that's informative to think about when we think about basic research is, where can we, engage people in the process? And one of the things that, I've struggled with, because I work with a lot of material scientists who work with very, technical equipment that, the public, can't just come in and do an experiment on, is instead, how do you recreate that experience of discovery? Not necessarily, seeing exactly the how can you model what you're looking at so that people are thinking about the same kinds of questions? And so I come back to how do we learn, thinking about what we know from neuroscience about how we process the information, how we connect it to what we know. Material science and nanoscale phenomena are very unfamiliar to a lot of people. But if that process can be somehow connected to something that they're familiar with, then that's a way in.
That's great, and I think this kind of goes to a little bit. I mean, we were talking about scientists, about people who are doing the work and engaging with the public. So Anne, I guess one question that came up was with institutional engagement, how could developing institutions promote staff passion for public engagement without necessarily forcing them to do it? How do you get scientists to get involved in this?
Well, starting at the very top, I would love to see the presidents of all the universities to make this a mandatory requirement in curricula development. But that being said, I think there are ways to really promote this and make it part of the discipline. I note that my own professional society, Ecological Society of America, has long asked for what they call, in a nutshell, in the beginning of publications, and they expect scientists to trim the entire body of the report into 3 nuggets that are simple declarative sentences that are readily understood in plain English. Getting the discipline and giving people the tools to be able to do that, to me, is a very important example of this. And then the other is just in public speaking, to be able to get people not only to get scientists to learn not just how to present in front of your peers, but how do you translate again that your body of work into a 1-minute storyline. We always talk about the elevator pitch. Well, it's not just the elevators, it's the airplanes, it's it's your family. It's just being able to communicate the work you do. So I think there are some steps that can be built in, but really the community has to start expecting this as part of our training, this is part of our learning as we go through our education. And then really, I don't joke about this, but I think expecting our faculty to, in fact, be able to be good communicators. But I did want to jump to one thing and follow up on the nanotech piece, because in a real world example, Forest Service research actually has been doing nanotechnology using cellulose and very complicated work. But I remember being in front of a decision maker, a policy maker, when we were trying to describe what we were doing. And finally, one of our scientists said, well, think of a gallon of milk. If I could have that gallon of milk turn red when it was about ready to expire, would that be interested? Yes. Well, that's nanotechnology. It's being able to take a common product, use your science to do something that solves my problem. And I think those are the kinds of tools that we really need to develop.
Yeah, that's great. That would be great to have. And sort of, about this bringing science to the public. Again, I mean, someone had a question that I think kind of goes off of that a little bit. this current move in science to make more studies, things behind paywalls, memberships, open, to have open access so that everyone, including the public, can access that information and find out more about it. Do you all have thoughts on that, about how that could contribute to this, better understanding perhaps of basic science, or not perhaps? Jayatri, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think at a very basic level, there's a cultural signal about the transparency of the process, is that, whether or not anybody can understand any given paper is a separate question. But the fact that you could access anything that's out there and being published, I think it is an important signal that, that science is as a field trying to be more transparent.
Great. And I think we have another couple questions here. So one thing, to go back to this idea about incentivizing science communication, or making scientists, researchers. Someone was asking, they work with scientists at their institution to develop plain language skills, relate more to their audience, reveal more of their own emotions about their research. And a lot of researchers say, I don't have time, I don't have training, all of that. Do you have thoughts on how to make this kind of more relevant for researchers as part of what they do? Kirsten, do you have any thoughts on that?
Bruce spoke a lot about, the institutional side of science, and if we're going to talk about the, putting power and stronger practice in science communication alongside the practice of science, it's got to come with what Anne talked about, is institutional commitment from the top down to incentivize, to respect, to make it count. You have to change what counts as academic practice. And until that prioritizes, recognizes, we've all experienced and seen the process of how someone advances their career, until that really prioritizes science communication. And shockingly, I'm not even sure that the pandemic has been enough to add urgency to making a shift on the role that scientists can play from academic and research organizations. So if that was not enough, it raises a good question for us of what will be enough to make that shift.
And I think, we're kind of coming up on our last question on kind of, I think this is a good kind of maybe final question going off of that. So how do you think about your goals in science, terms of science communication, where, maybe there's no real desire to have this two-way engagement with members of the public, or the public is resistant perhaps? How do you think about what your goals might be when you're talking about science communication? Anne, do you have some final thoughts on that?
Well, so I'm just going to carry on with my theme of making it real and trying to bring the complex into a common language that the individual you're talking to understands or appreciates because of the problem they're having, an issue that they have, but making it real to them. But I do think one of the hardest things to break through, not only from the science to understanding science, but also from a policymaker perspective, is the nature of uncertainty in science. And I really don't know how to get over that, because, and I think the pandemic has made it very clear, the public did not like the fact that we didn't know the answer, and it had one answer that was stable over time. And yet we know in science it's not going to happen. So somehow addressing that uncertainty issue, I don't know how to crack that nut, but I think it is a really important one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, and I'd add to that some of this is not about every single scientist being a science communicator, but as a scientist, you can be transparent about your identity and your processes, right? And some of the leaders in science communication on social media are not leaders because they're excellent at translating their research. They're leaders because they are deeply human in their public persona, and they do more to advance the fact that science is not neutral, that science is practiced by a huge range of individuals. That that presence, that vulnerability, that transparency goes a long way towards positioning the nature of science in the public eye.
And I think that wraps up our panel. So thank you, everyone, for participating. And that was a great discussion. And just a reminder to check out all the other sessions at the conference. And of course, there's also the Connection Lounges and the Idea Lab. So thanks again to our panelists and for everyone who joined at home.